Before we start, tell me where you're listening from. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next tale. The first thing I noticed about him was the way he held his coffee mug. Like it was the only warm thing in the entire city. His fingers wrapped around it with this careful grip. And even from across the courtyard through 2 panes of glass and 20 feet of cold Chicago air, I could feel the weight of that gesture. The quiet loneliness of it. I'd moved to Chicago 3 days before the first real snow. And I was standing in my half-unpacked apartment with a floor lamp in one corner and boxers stacked everywhere else, wondering if starting over was supposed to feel this empty, or if I'd made a terrible mistake. South Loop looked like somebody had shaken a snow globe over it. The city felt half-finished and half-magical. Garlands and string lights were already draped across balconies, but the sidewalks were still wet from the last rain, waiting for that first layer of white to make everything look softer than it really was. My new apartment was on the 4th floor of a historic brick building, the kind that creaks in the right places and smells faintly, like old wood in someone else's cooking. The listing had promised courtyard views, which I didn't really care about. When I signed the lease, I just needed somewhere to land. That wasn't the place I'd been trying to escape. Then I saw him, and suddenly those courtyard views became the only thing that mattered. It was that first night I'd put my single floor lamp in the far corner by the window, the only source of light in a sea of moving boxers. I flipped it on, and as the warm yellow glow spilled across my half-unpacked life, I glanced out toward the courtyard, just to see what those views actually looked like in the dark. Across the courtyard, behind half-open curtains, in apartment for B, a man stood at his own window. He was backlit by a small lamp on a side table, wearing a dark sweatshirt that looked soft and worn in. One hand wrapped around a mug, the steam rising in a thin curl that caught the light. His other hand lifted just slightly when he noticed me. Not a full wave, just a small, almost shy curve of his fingers. Like he wasn't sure if acknowledging me would be welcome or weird. I froze with an armful of bubble wrap, caught between wanting to duck down and wanting to wave back. My heart doing this stupid little skip that I immediately told myself to ignore. Instead, I did what any socially anxious over starting over in a new city would do. I smiled, a small testing smile, the kind you give a stranger on the train when you're not sure if they're being friendly, or if you're about to become a cautionary tale. Then I pretended to straighten the lamp like I hadn't been caught, staring at my neighbor like the opening scene of a romantic comedy I'd watched too many times. When I looked back up, he had turned a little, as if to give me privacy, but the lamp beside him flicked a bit brighter. A quiet acknowledgement, a matching of energy that felt strangely intimate, for 2 people who'd never spoken a word. I had no idea then how quickly that small moment would wedge itself into the empty space of my new life, or how much I'd start structuring my evenings around the glow of a lamp I couldn't even touch. I came to Chicago to stop repeating myself, to stop falling for people who were never really mine, who came half available, still attached to their old lives, their old lovers, their unresolved stories that I was somehow always expected to work around. My last relationship had been one long series of almost and not yet, until one day it was just no, delivered with all the casual cruelty of someone who'd already moved on weeks before telling me. So I told myself this move was about clean slates, new city, new job, new patterns, new Maury waiting for someone to choose me when I was clearly never going to be the first choice. No messy entanglements, no falling for someone who might already belong to someone else, and definitely no getting emotionally attached to the man behind the half-open curtains who probably had a whole life I knew nothing about, except that's exactly what my brain started doing, because apparently I'm very good at ignoring my own rules when they become inconvenient. The next night, I got back from a late run to Target with a bag of basic groceries and way too many kinds of tea I didn't need. The kind of impulse shopping you do when you're trying to convince yourself that chamomile and peppermint can fix the hollow feeling of starting over. The courtyard was glowing this time, little fairy lights, crisscrossing the space between our two brick buildings, like a low-budget movie set designed specifically to make everything feel more romantic than it actually was. I set the grocery bag down, shrugged off my coat that was still damp from the mist outside, and automatically turned on my lamp without thinking, the gesture already becoming muscle memory. A few seconds later, across the way, the light in 4B clicked on too, and my breath caught in a way that felt both thrilling and mortifying. I stepped closer to the window, telling myself I was just checking the courtyard lights, that I wasn't actively seeking him out, like some kind of desperate protagonist in a story I'd already lived. Too many times. There he was again, same spot, same lamp beside him, casting that warm glow across what looked like a cluttered but cozy space. This time, he was in a soft-looking gray t-shirt, hair slightly messy like he'd been running his hands through it, and I could see the line of his jaw more clearly now, the way his mouth curved up slightly at one corner when he spotted me. He lifted his mug toward me in a small toast, casual and easy, then took a sip while maintaining eye contact in a way that made my stomach flip. I felt my cheeks warm like I'd just taken a shot, instead of a sip of cheap peppermint tea from a box I'd bought on sale. My hands fumbled for my own mug on the counter, empty, but I lifted it anyway, miming a little toast back, trying to match his energy, his ease. He smiled, like he knew my mug was empty, like he could see right through the glass and the distance, and my carefully constructed walls, and something about that smile made me want to simultaneously hide and move closer. It became a ritual before I even admitted it to myself, this nightly choreography of light and presence and unspoken acknowledgement. By the end of the week, we had developed a whole silent language that felt more intimate than most conversations I'd had with people who actually knew my last name. I'd get home, drop my bag with a thud that echoed in my spouse apartment, flip on my lamp, and a beat later, his light would appear like clockwork, like he'd been waiting, like this mattered to him, too. Sometimes he'd already be there when I got in, half turned to the window like he was waiting for something, and pretending not to be, his posture tense until my lamp came on, and his shoulders would visibly relax. Sometimes I'd be late, stuck on a train or caught in a work call that ran over it, and I'd see him pace in and out of frame, through his window, like he was debating whether to stay, or if maybe I wasn't coming tonight, if maybe I'd decided this whole thing was too weird to continue. We never full-on waved, it was always those half gestures that felt safer somehow, less committal, a lift of a mug, a tilt of a head, a quick smile, before one of us pulled away to do something normal, like cook dinner or answer emails or pretend we weren't slowly designing our evenings around a stranger's lamp, around the warm glow of connection without the risk of actual contact. It felt harmless at first, comforting even, like the quiet company you feel sitting by the window of a crowded cafe, sipping something warm while the city moves outside. Present but separate, seen but sappy. A soft hum of presence without obligation, without the possibility of being let down when someone inevitably decided I wasn't worth staying for. Then I saw her, and everything shifted. It was a Friday night, the first real snow starting to fall over the courtyard in fat, lazy flakes, soft and white, and catching the fairy lights like glitter suspended in honey. I was still half in my work clothes, blazer discarded over a chair, laptop open on the kitchen counter where I'd been pretending to finish a report while actually just staring at nothing. My mind already drifting toward the window, toward him, toward that nightly moment of connection I'd started craving like caffeine. I was pouring myself tea, the water still steaming, when I noticed movement across the way, and my eyes went straight to 4B before my brain even registered what it was doing. Before I could stop the automatic pull of my attention toward his space, his light, his presence. He was there. Of course he was, standing near his window, in a dark blue Henley that looked soft enough to touch. Sleeves pushed up to his elbows in a way that made my mouth go dry. But he wasn't alone. A woman walked into view behind him, laughing at something he said, her whole body animated with the kind of ease that only comes from deep familiarity. She was carrying a stack of folded blankets, hair piled in a messy bun, that looked effortlessly pretty, wearing an oversized sweater that slouched off one shoulder like it had been washed 100 times, and she loved it anyway. He reached out and took the top blanket from her, their hands brushing in that casual, familiar way that says, "We've done this 1,000 times," that says we know each other's rhythms, that says there's history here I'm not part of. My throat tightened, my grip on my mug becoming painful, as I watched them move around each other like a well-choreographed dance. She disappeared from the frame for a second, then came back, carrying something small and bright, pinning it to the wall, near the window with the kind of focused concentration that felt domestic, settled, permanent. A small string of star-shaped lights slowly blinked to life as she adjusted them, and he held the end of the string up for her so she could plug it in, his other hand steadying her elbow. When she stretched up on her toes, they moved around each other like they'd been choreographed by years of shared space, bodies fitting together in ways that made my chest ache, with a familiar hollowness I'd promised myself I wouldn't feel again. Not here, not in this new life I was trying to build. I stepped back from my own window like I'd just walked in on something I shouldn't have. Like I was the intruder in a story that clearly had no room for me. My reflection stared back from the dark glass, eyes a little too shiny, jaw set in that tight way that meant I was mad at myself for letting this happen again, for falling into the same pattern. I'd moved across state lines to escape. There it is, I thought bitterly, that old familiar twist. In my stomach that felt like disappointment and resignation, mixed with a sharp edge of self-directed anger. Unavailable, of course he's unavailable, because why would anything be different this time? Why would I suddenly develop the ability to read situations correctly and protect myself from becoming the optional person in someone else's comfortable life? I turned off my lamp before he looked up and caught me watching, plunging my apartment into darkness that felt heavier than it should. The courtyard lights outside suddenly looking less like fairy tale magic and more like cheap decoration on something fundamentally broken. In the dim reflection of my dark window, I could see my own face, features blurred but recognizable, and I whispered it out loud. Just to make it real, just to force myself to accept it. No more patterns. Remember? That's why you're here. That's the whole point. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter over the next few days. That it was a good thing, actually. A clean break from a connection. That was only ever going to lead somewhere messy and painful. People live with roommates, I told myself while making coffee in the morning, while getting ready for work, while deliberately not looking toward the courtyard. People have friends who are comfortable enough to help them hang lights and fold blankets and laugh like they share inside jokes that you'll never be part of. Maybe she was his sister, I reasoned while riding the train, staring at my phone without really seeing it. His cousin, his best friend from college, who needed a place to stay. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent explanation that would make all of this okay. That would mean I hadn't been slowly falling for someone who belonged to someone else. Maybe. But my body didn't care about maybe. It knew the shape of this story too well, had lived it enough times, to recognize the outline even when the details were slightly different. The half-open curtains, the almost but not quite explanations, the just close enough to feel something, just far enough to never really have it, the perpetual state of waiting for someone to choose you when you were never actually a choice at all. So I pulled back, because that's what you do when you finally learn to protect yourself, even if it feels like cutting off circulation to something that was just starting to come alive. The next 2 nights, I got home and deliberately avoided the window, kept my eyes down as I moved through my apartment, turned my lamp on only after drawing my curtains halfway, so I could have light without the possibility of connection. I made tea mechanically, cooked frozen meals that tasted like cardboard, scrolled endlessly on my phone like a teenager trying to numb out. Anything to keep from glancing toward the courtyard, from seeking out his light, from allowing myself to hope for something that clearly wasn't available. But old habits are loud, especially the ones wrapped in loneliness and the desperate human need to feel seen by someone, anyone. Even if it's just through glass and distance and a shared moment of light in the darkness. On the third night, I cracked, because apparently my self-control has limits, and I'd reached all of them. I went to the window just to see the snow, which was the lie. I fed myself as I set my mug of chai on the sill, the spices warming my hands and filling the air with that comforting scent of cinnamon and cardamom, and something that always made me think of patience, of things that are worth the slow simmer. The city outside was quieter under the thin white blanket, the courtyard lights soft and hazy through the falling snow. Everything muted and peaceful in that particular way that only happens when winter decides to be gentle. For B was dark, and I told myself that was good, that this was the universe giving me exactly what I'd asked for. A clean break, an end to this thing before it could become another mistake I'd have to recover from. I didn't feel good. I felt hollow and stupid, and irrationally angry at myself for caring about a stranger's lamp. I turned to walk away, to go back to my couch and my laptop and my carefully constructed isolation, and right then, his light flicked on like he'd been waiting in the dark for me. Like he'd noticed my absence, and it had mattered. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and slowly, so slowly, I turned back toward the window. He stepped into view, tugging the curtains open a bit more than usual, like he was making himself more visible on purpose, inviting me back in. He wore a dark green hoodie, sleeves pushed up to his forearms, in a way that shouldn't be attractive but absolutely was, and he glanced toward my window like a quick check, like confirming I was really there, and when he saw me, his shoulders visibly relaxed, tension I hadn't even noticed draining from his posture. He reached over to his table, grabbed something I couldn't quite make out, and then lifted it toward the glass with both hands, holding it carefully like an offering. A candle, small and white in a simple glass holder. He lit it with a match, the small flame flaring bright orange before settling into a steady golden glow, and he set it down. Right on his windowsill, the tiny flame mirrored in the glass between us, dancing slightly in some invisible draft. My heart did something stupid and hopeful in my chest, that traitorous muscle that never learned when to protect itself. Without thinking, moving on, instinct alone, I plucked one of my own tea lights from the box I hadn't unpacked all the way, found matchas in a drawer, and lit it with trembling fingers, setting it on my sill to match his two small flames across a courtyard, to people reaching toward each other in the safest way they knew how. His smile was small but unmistakable, and even through the distance and the glass I could feel the warmth of it, the relief, like we'd both been holding our breath and finally remembered how to exhale. There we were again, two strangers in two old buildings, separated by 20 feet of cold air and 4 panes of glass, and probably a dozen complications I didn't know about yet, sharing fire like some modern version of a camp story. Like light was a language we both understood better than words. The woman didn't walk into frame that night, but the idea of her stayed, a ghost at the edge of every flicker of light. A reminder that I still didn't know his story, didn't know if there was room in it for me or if I was just a pleasant distraction from whatever life he was actually living. A couple of days later, I found the flyer that would change everything. Slipped under my door, the paper slightly bent like someone had shoved it through without much care. Residents' Holiday Gathering, Courtyard Lounge, December 10th, 7 p.m. Hot cider, cookies, and music. Bring yourself, a neighbor, or a snack. Ugly sweaters, optional. I flipped the paper over, like there might be fine print. Something like also the cute guy across the courtyard will be there, with his mysterious not sure what she is woman. So, prepare your heart accordingly, but it was blank. Just cheap white paper and cheerful Helvetica font that promised community and warmth and all the things I'd been avoiding since moving here. I held the flyer up toward my window without thinking, my own reflection overlapping with the faint outline of 4B, visible in the growing dusk, and I stood there like an idiot, trying to decide if I was brave enough to show up, to risk the possibility of awkwardness and misread signals, and the weird ache of seeing his hand on someone else's back. While I hovered near the cookie table, pretending not to care about something I absolutely cared about, I could ignore it, stay in my apartment, watch a movie I'd seen 12 times, avoid the whole messy situation. Or I could go meet other people, be a normal adult, in a new city trying to build a life that involved more than just a job and a lamp ritual with a stranger. Drink hot cider that probably came from a mix, laugh at someone's ugly sweater, maybe talk to him, hear his voice, find out his name, confirm finally what the woman from his apartment meant to him. Have you ever felt tension like this with someone you shouldn't? What would you do in this moment? On December 10th, I stood in front of my mirror for 20 minutes, pulling at the hem of my sweater like it might magically transform into something cooler if I tugged at it enough. Like the right outfit could protect me from whatever awkwardness was waiting downstairs. My reflection stared back with judgment. Jeans that fit well, but not too well, soft cream-colored sweater that looked expensive, but wasn't, hair in loose waves I'd actually taken time to style, even though I'd told myself this wasn't a big deal. Minimal makeup, just enough to look like I'd tried but not like I was performing. Not like I cared too much about a random tenant event. That probably wouldn't matter in a month. I'm just going to a building thing, I told my reflection firmly, trying to convince myself as much as her. This is not a date. This is community building. This is being a responsible adult who participates in neighborhood activities. Like a normal person who has their life together. My reflection didn't look convinced, and honestly, neither was I. I grabbed the tin of store-bought cookies I'd arranged somewhat nicely on a plate earlier, took a deep breath that didn't quite fill my lungs all the way, and headed downstairs before I could change my mind and spend the evening hiding in my apartment like usual. The courtyard lounge was really just a slightly larger room off the lobby, with a fake fireplace that hummed when it ran, to mismatched couches that had seen better days, and a folding table someone had draped with a red tablecloth that was too short on one side. The building manager, a tall woman named Denise, who always smelled like vanilla lotion and had that aggressive cheerfulness of someone who genuinely loves their job, stood by a crock-pot labeled mulled cider, ladling steaming liquid into paper cups and smiling at everyone. Like we were at a 5-star event instead of a basement gathering with fluorescent lighting. About a dozen people milled around with that particular brand of awkwardness that comes from forced socialization with people you've only ever nodded at in passing, everyone wearing versions of the same polite tenant smile that said, "I'm friendly, but please don't expect actual friendship from this interaction." I scanned the room automatically, my pulse ticking a little faster, with each face that wasn't his. Disappointment and relief mixing in equal measure. He wasn't there. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, tension draining from my shoulders as I made my way to the food table. Telling myself this was better, actually, easier, less complicated, I set my cookies down among the other offerings, brownies that looked homemade and impressive, cheese cubes on toothpicks, and something that looked aggressively like fruitcake that no one was touching. "Hey there," Denise said brightly, appearing beside me with that smile. That seemed too energetic for 7 p.m. on a weeknight. "You must be new. I haven't seen you around before." "Yeah, just moved into 4A, I said, accepting a cup of cider that smelled more like cinnamon potpourri than actual apples. "I'm Ava. Welcome, Ava, from 4A. She grinned, like we were old friends now. "Grab some cookies, mingle, make yourself at home." We're a friendly building once you get past everyone's initial terror. Avis, small talk. I was midway through my first sip, the cider burning slightly on the way down, and tasting exactly as artificial as I'd expected, when the door opened behind me with a gust of cold air, and the subtle shift in energy that happens when someone important enters a room. You know that cliché in movies, when the room sort of blurs, and all the sound dulls for a second when someone walks in, when everything goes soft focus except for that one person. I always thought that was dramatic nonsense invented by screenwriters who'd never actually experienced attraction, just imagined it, based on other movies they'd seen. Turns out it happens. Or maybe my brain just decided to be dramatic on my behalf because apparently I hadn't learned anything from the past 2 years of trying to be sensible about feelings. He walked in wearing a dark navy sweater that fit him perfectly, and jeans that looked worn in and comfortable, shaking a bit of snow from his dark hair, droplets catching the overhead light. He scanned the room quickly with an almost nervous energy, and when his eyes found mine, there was this small, honest surprise there, his eyebrows lifting slightly, his mouth opening just a fraction, like he hadn't been sure I'd actually show up and was genuinely pleased that I had. My grip tightened around the paper cup, the cider suddenly smelling too sweet, too cloying, the heat of it uncomfortable against my palms. He started toward me with purpose, weaving between people who tried to stop him for conversation, and I stood frozen near the dessert table trying to remember how to breathe normally. "Eva from 4A, Denise said brightly beside me, completely unaware of the electric shift in the air of the way. My entire nervous system had just gone on high alert. "This is Ethan, from 4B. Ethan, of course, his name would be something that looked good, handwritten in a margin, the kind of name you'd write accidentally, while testing a pen and then stare at for a second too long, tracing the letters like they meant something. "Hi," I managed, turning toward him fully, trying to arrange my face into something casual even though my heart was doing gymnastics. "Hey," he said, and his voice was warm and lower than I'd expected, with a slight rasp, like maybe he'd been talking a lot earlier, or not enough, and the sound of it did something inconvenient to my stomach. "Nice to officially meet you, without the glass between us." My cheeks flared hot. "So, you have noticed me." His mouth tipped up in a smile that reached his eyes, creating small lines at the corners that I wanted to trace with my fingers. "Hard not to," he said. "You have great lamp timing." We stood there for a second that stretched longer than it should, smiling at each other like idiots while the rest of the room faded into a gentle clatter of plates and low conversation. That became just background noise. "How are you liking Chicago so far?" he asked, shifting his weight slightly closer, besides the part where it gets dark at like 3 in the afternoon and makes you question all your life choices. "It's good," I said, trying to sound normal instead of completely aware of how close he was standing, of how he smelled faintly like cedar and something clean I couldn't quite name. "Colder than I remembered from the brochures, but the city lights make you up for it." He laughed, a real sound that made his whole face change. "Yeah, they really lean into the holiday sparkle to distract us from the frostbite and the wind that comes off the lake, like it's personally angry at everyone." We fell into easy conversation that felt nothing like the awkward, small talk happening around us, and I couldn't believe how natural it was, how his jokes landed in the exact space my chest needed them to, how our silences were surprisingly comfortable instead of anxious, little pockets of quiet where the fake fireplace crackled, and the scent of cinnamon hung heavy in the air, and I could just exist next to him without having to perform. He told me he'd grown up just outside the city, moved back for work after a few years in Minneapolis, that he described as character building in the way that really means, "It was terrible, but I survived." I told him about my cross-state move, about starting over, and wanting something different, carefully editing out the messier reasons behind it, the heartbreak and the pattern of choosing people who were never going to choose me back, Everything about it felt embarrassingly natural, like we'd been friends for years, instead of strangers who'd only communicated through window light, and I could feel it happening. That slow, warm feeling sliding into my bones, the one that felt a little like the first sip of chai on a cold morning, comforting and spiced with something you can't quite name. But that makes everything feel more possible. Then she walked in, and my carefully constructed hope shattered like cheap glass. The woman from his apartment breezed into the room with the confidence of someone who belonged here, cheeks pink from the cold, shrugging off a tan coat that looked like it had stories, hair down this time in waves that spilled over her shoulders, in a way that looked effortless and probably took 20 minutes. She scanned the room with bright eyes and zeroed in on Ethan with a smile that spoke of deep familiarity, of shared history, of inside jokes I would never understand. My stomach dropped so fast, I felt dizzy. "Hey," she said cheerfully, weaving through people to reach us, with the easy grace of someone who knew exactly where she fit. Without hesitation, without any awareness of how the gesture would land, she slid her hand into the crook of his arm like it was the most natural thing in the world, like she'd done it 1,000 times before. My chest tightened painfully. I looked down at my cider, studying the swirling spices like they held answers. "Hey, no worries," he said, giving her that same easy smile I'd seen from across the courtyard, and I hated how much it hurt to see him smile at her like that, like she mattered. He turned a little toward me, like he was about to say something, to explain maybe, but the moment was gone before it began, swallowed by her presence. "I'm Maya," she said, turning to me with friendly eyes that had no idea they were stabbing me. "You must be new. I don't think I've seen you around." "Ava," I said, forcing my voice to come out steady even though everything inside me was screaming to leave, to protect myself, to stop this before it became another story of me wanting someone who was already taken. "I'm in for a nice," she said with genuine warmth. "We're 4B. You've probably heard my terrible taste in late-night TV. Through the walls, sorry in advance, we." The word landed like a small sharp stone in my chest, heavy and painful and impossibly final. I nodded, pretending the paper cup in my hand was suddenly the most fascinating object in the room, anything to avoid. Looking at how comfortable they were together, how her hands stayed linked through his arm like it belonged there. Ethan opened his mouth, his eyes on me with something that looked like concern, but someone called his name from across the room. An older man waving him over to the dessert table with aggressive enthusiasm. "Hold that thought," he said to me quickly, something urgent in his voice. "I'll be right back." He walked away and I watched him go, feeling Maya's presence beside me like a weight. He's not exaggerating when he says he has no impulse control. "Around cookies?" she said conversationally, apparently oblivious to my internal collapse. "One time he ate an entire tin of those butter cookies in like 20 minutes and then..." Her phone buzzed, interrupting the story I absolutely didn't want to hear. She glanced down and her whole face lit up in a way I recognized intimately. That special glow reserved for one particular name on your screen. For the person who matters most. "She's here," Maya said, mostly to herself, then looked up at me with a grin that transformed her features. "My girlfriend. I told her I'd meet her out front so she doesn't have to deal with the parking nightmare around here." I blinked, the words not quite computing. "Your girlfriend." "Yeah," she laughed, already texting back with quick fingers. "At the holiday market, walk around in the cold for 2 hours just to buy a $3 cookie and pretend it was worth the frostbites." The room tilted slightly, my perception rearranging itself. Like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, I gripped my cup tighter, afraid I might drop it. "Oh," I breathed, half air, half sound. "Nice, that sounds fun." "You should go," she said enthusiastically, tucking her phone away. "It's great, seriously. Go with a friend or something. Or a cute neighbor." She wiggled her eyebrows just enough to make it crystal clear she meant Ethan, that she was actively trying to set us up, that there was no we except the kind that meant roommates who wanted each other to be happy. Before I could figure out what to say to that, how to process this complete inversion of everything I'd assumed, she squeezed my elbow in a gesture that felt genuinely friendly. Be right back. It was nice meeting you, Ava. You too, I managed, my voice sounding far away even to my own ears. She disappeared out the door in a swirl of scarf and tan coat, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and a completely restructured reality, and the air felt weirdly lighter and heavier. At the same time, possibility and relief mixing into something I couldn't quite name yet. I stood there, the truth rearranging itself in my chest, like puzzle pieces that had been forced together wrong, and were finally finding their actual places. Roommate, not girlfriend, not partner, not a silent guarantee that he had already been claimed, and I was once again falling for someone unavailable. Just Maya, his friend, his housemate, with a whole life, and a girlfriend of her own, and absolutely zero romantic connection to the man whose lamp I'd been watching for weeks. Patterns in my head, the ones I'd convinced myself I knew how to read after years of getting it wrong, started to crumble like sugar dissolving in hot tea. I looked up across the room and found Ethan watching me, his conversation abandoned, his eyes locked on mine, with an intensity that made my breath catch. He must have seen Maya leave, seen me standing there, like someone had just told me the ending of a movie I thought I knew, rewritten the story I'd been telling myself. He set his plate down, without looking at it, said something quick to the guy beside him, and then came back through the crowd, weaving between people like the room had narrowed down to a single path between us. Sorry, he said when he reached me, slightly breathless. I got ambushed by Denise and her extremely detailed lecture about the new recycling schedule that apparently I violated last week. It's okay, I said, trying to steady my voice, to sound normal when everything inside me was reorganizing itself around this new information. His eyes searched my face with concern. You okay? You look like something happened. I could have played it off, pretended nothing had shifted, maintained my careful distance, but something about the candle rituals, and the silent toasts, and his careful, gentle smile across the courtyard made me feel braver than I'd been in a long time. Made me want to try being honest instead of self-protecting. I thought Maya was your girlfriend, I blurted out, then immediately winced at my own boldness, at how desperate and presumptuous that sounded out loud. Sorry, that was probably a weird thing to say. His eyebrows lifted in genuine surprise, and then he laughed, a sound soft and disbelieving and maybe a little bit relieved. Wow, he said. No, God, no. She's great, but we would drive each other completely insane in a relationship. We can barely agree on what to watch on TV. She's my roommate and my friend, and very, very into women who are decidedly not me. Heat flooded my face. I just saw her in your apartment a lot, helping with lights and blankets and stuff. I jumped to conclusions, like I always do, like I've been trained to expect the worst possible interpretation of every situation. Fair, he said, still smiling but gentler now. She's basically the queen of cozy domestic stuff. Those starlights in our window, all her. Left to my own devices, my place would just be one sad lamp and a stack of pizza boxers I'm too lazy to take to recycling. I've seen the lamp, I said before I could stop myself, before I could remember to be cool and mysterious instead of honest and awkward. His smile widened, something warm and pleased crossing his features. Yeah, I've seen yours too, and I'm pretty sure you've seen my pizza box collection through the window, so we're even on the embarrassing observations. Silence settled between us, but this time it buzzed with something bright and promising instead of uncomfortable, charged with possibility instead of dread. He shifted his weight, nerves visible in the way his fingers flexed around his cup, in the way he took a breath, like he was gathering courage. Listen, he said, this might sound forward, but have you been to the holiday market yet? The one over by the park? I shook my head. Not yet. I was planning to go at some point, but I haven't gotten around to it, too busy unpacking and pretending I have my life together. Would you maybe want to go now? He asked, the words coming out a little rushed, like he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. With me, we could walk over, grab some caramel cider, complain about how cold it is while secretly loving it. Like everyone does. My heart did that double beat thing again, that traitor organ that never learned to protect itself. Yeah, I said softly, honestly, I'd like that a lot. Can you feel the weight of this choice? Would you have said yes to this moment? Have you ever misread a situation only to realize later your heart was trying to protect you from past patterns? Would you have kept your distance like Ava, or leaned into a connection right away? And if you had a neighbor like Ethan watching you from across a snowy courtyard, would you have gone to that holiday market? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next tale, and tell me your own story. In the comments, have you ever had a window crush? Or a neighbor you couldn't stop thinking about? Grab a cup, your daily dose of delight.